All right, everyone. So what we're going to be doing today is going through the basics of the skeletal system. So in this lecture video, we're going to be emphasizing kind of the functions of the skeletal system, but also starting to dive into some of the microscopic anatomy. Okay, so kind of what it takes to build bone, like structurally, and how and what cells are inside of bones, and how those things work together to continue to allow for the function in this particular system. Okay, so the skeletal system itself, right, consists of all of the bones of the human body, as well as the ligaments and joints. So the places in which we actually allow those bones to come together, right? So where we're actually having articulations, like say in your elbow, right, where we're putting together our radius and ulna with our humerus, right? That area there that has not only just the bones where they're putting each other, but the ligaments around it that hold the bones together, right? And the joints in which those things move around. Okay, so that is all the parts of our skeletal system, right? And so the reason why we're talking about the skeletal system is that in this class, as we're emphasizing motion later on when we're talking about it, we need to know not only how the bones get put together structurally, because that is the main kind of leverage point that allows our muscles to work, right? We also need to be able to describe and talk about what's going on with how the muscles are attaching to those things, and then how and why we're dictated by the range of the particular motion types we get at each of our joints. Okay, so let's just go through and talk about again the function. So that's one thing we've just want to reiterate, right, is that every organ system is going to have a series of functions that allow it to do what it needs to do. Okay, so the main function of the skeletal system is to really provide support. Okay, so it's the structural framework for the entire body, and it allows detachment for muscles and other inside membrane. So again, your skeletal system provides support not only for the musculature and then the integument that's surrounding all of that, like your skin, but also it provides locations for different membranes inside the body to hold things together. So for example, there are projections and points inside of your skull where your membranes that surround your brain allow it to attach so that your brain isn't completely knocking around inside of your skull all the time. Okay. Another major reason, or another major function, is the storage of many different materials. So we store minerals inside of our bones, specifically calcium and phosphorus are two of the big ones that we need to carry out a whole bunch of different functions. But it also allows us to maintain storage of extra energy. So we actually store some fat inside of our bones in the form of yellow bone marrow. There are other types of marrow that allow us to produce cells and things like that, which we'll talk about a little bit, right? But adipose is actually stored inside of your bones, and you have a good storage area there that's not only protected, right, but it's kind of like that last resort fat, the like kind of last bit that we get to if our body enters an area where we're experiencing kind of lean times in terms of food and what we're getting. Okay. Another function of the skeletal system is blood cell production. So it's producing not only your erythrocytes, but also a lot of your white blood cells and some other different kind of cell parts like platelets and other fibers that are found in your fluid connective tissue are all produced inside of the bone, specifically in your long bones, so like what's happening in your humerus and your femur, as well as some of your flat bones, like your ribs and your scapula are actually very vital for the production of different bone. And this all happens in the red marrow of the bone. So it's called yellow marrow because it's fatty, right? It's got a lot of adipose, which kind of has a yellow hue to it. And then red marrow because there's a lot of blood vessels there. There's a lot of energy necessary to create more cells. All of that's going to the parts of the bone that are considered red. Okay. All right. Another function is protection. So again, the bones surround a lot of the soft organs inside of your body to protect them from external damage. So like if you get hit or someone punches you, right, you've got the bone that's coming there first before you get to the organs that are underneath. Okay. And then lastly, another major function is leverage, right? So your bones function to help generate the force necessary for your muscles to actually do what they do best, which is to push and pull, right? You need a point in which we're attaching to allow us to carry out that push and that pull. Okay, so talking about leverage, right? A lot of our muscles function sort of as levers, right? That simple machine that we'll talk a little bit about later, right? In order to actually generate enough force for your object to actually do or actually move, okay, to make movement happen. Okay. So inside of the bone, one of the things I do want to point out is that there are some different structural features inside of the bone. Okay, so specifically bone as a tissue, right? So bone itself is actually a supporting connective tissue. So it's like cartilage in that it's there to support all the other different functions that are there. Like cartilage, we learned, is a support for a lot of different features inside the body. Like you have soft cartilage of your nose and your ear that provide the structural components there, but bone is like a much denser cartilage there to provide support for a lot more mass. Okay, so again, bone, or what we call osseous tissue, it's called osseous because it's been ossified, right? In that we are actually allowing our object to, let me focus this a little bit, right, are allowing the support there, okay? So inside of our bone, we do have specialized cells. So like in cartilage, when we talked about that, cartilage having chondrocytes, bone has their own cell types. And there are 3 of them that you need to know. The first is an osteocyte, which I'll talk more about, right, which is essentially just a general bone cell. An osteoblast, right? So blast cells are going to be cells that end up are responsible for kind of the production of new cells. And then osteoclast, and any clastic cell, is one that kind of breaks things apart, okay? And so when we're talking about the matrix, again, because this is a connective tissue, you need to be able to describe its matrix. Its matrix is made up of mostly collagen, right? That's going to be a large portion of what's actually going on the bone, right? And it's going to be in a very dense ground substance. So the ground substance is actually being calcified, right, with calcium salt, specifically calcium phosphate. Okay, so calcium phosphate is actually what's making up a majority of the skeleton here. Okay, it's different from other organisms that you might have seen, like that have calcium carbonate as like kind of the shell or kind of the inner bone of that. Calcium phosphate is a lot stronger. Okay, and that it can support more weight. It's a lot denser in how it gets packed in a crystalline structure, right? It actually allows for kind of a stronger support. Not only that, is that by having calcium phosphate, right, we have an additional source for actually storing phosphorus in that form, and we can actually break it apart and get that phosphorus that we need to not only say help produce extra ATP, right, if we're going through cellular respiration, but also to help build things like DNA and other structures, right? By storing that there, we're able to hold on to it for later. Okay, all right. So let's move into talking about kind of the microscopic pieces, right? We've talked about the tissues that are inside of bone. Let's actually talk about what the microscopic bone is going to look like inside of the human body. Okay, so let's begin by just talking about bone as a connective tissue. Okay, so just more deets on that. Okay, so microscopic bone, right? If we're talking about bone as a connective tissue, it is very similar to cartilage. Okay, so right, it carries out pretty much the same exact features, right? Is that your bone as a connective tissue, it's going to have a ground substance. It's got a very limited matrix. It's mostly made up of collagen, right? Again, that's the main protein inside of cartilage, as well as those calcium compounds I just mentioned. Okay, so like in cartilage, the cells inside of your bones live in a lacunae, right? They live in this pocketed out area, because in cartilage, right, if you had that lacunae gone, your cells would just get kind of smushed and smushed and smushed together where they wouldn't function. Okay, same happens in bones, and even more so because you have that calcium phosphate that's coming in that's forcing those things together. Okay, all right, so again, cells live in a lacunae like the other structures. Okay, so let's talk more about the specific cells. Okay, so as I mentioned before, an osteocyte is found in mature bone, and it's the essential cell for just kind of day-to-day maintenance, right? It's what's actually allowing your bones to, you know, if there's minor things that need to get repaired, or it helps rebuild or build different things, but it's also responsible for the diffusion of materials across all the parts of your bone, right, to bring those materials in to allow us to actually build and modify different features inside of the bone. Okay, so the osteocyte is just a general bone cell. Okay. There are specialized cells inside of bone, because bone is actually an organ that's constantly being torn down and built up, torn down and built up, torn down and built up. Is that basically every 7 years you have essentially a brand new skeleton? It's kind of the statistic. It's more or less true. In that you've got the cells that actually do that. So there are 2 types of cells that allow your bodies to actually tear stuff down and build stuff up. Okay, and those 2 cells are the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts. So osteoclasts, as I mentioned before, any clastic type cell is going to be a cell that breaks down something. Okay, so osteo referring to bone, and osteoclast is going to be a cell that's going to break down different parts of your bone. Okay, and they do this to help regulate the amount of calcium and phosphorus that's contained inside of your bone, but it's also responsible for helping build stronger structures. Like say if you have damage to the bone, it'll actually kind of go into that area, tears parts down to allow you to build stronger bone to fix whatever gets broken. Okay, so osteoclasts are actually really huge cells. They're like crazy big. They can have anywhere from like 25 to 50 to even more nuclei that are actually contained in one of these cells, right? Because their main job is just to produce a ton of enzyme, right? Bone is dense. Bone is hard to break down. And so you need a lot of enzymes that allow us to break down the calcium phosphate bonds that are very strong, right? It's an ionic compound. It's going to be fairly strongly put together, right? You need a lot of enzyme to help break that down. So osteoclasts are extremely large cells. There's not a whole lot of them, right? There don't need to be a whole lot of them because they're so big, right? But they're not that many inside of the cells, or inside of the bone. Okay. The other type that you have is an osteoblast. So osteoblasts are cells that are responsible for the production of new bone. Okay, so their main job is to actually do what we call osteogenesis. Okay, so osteogenesis is anything that's genesis means like formation, like to generate. Or if you think of Genesis, like in the Bible, for example, right? That chapter in the Bible is all about the formation of the earth. So again, just kind of that root of gen means to produce, like generation or anything like that. Okay, so in the osteogenesis, again, what we're doing is we're actually producing the bone matrix, right? We're allowing ourselves to produce cartilage, right? As allowing ourselves collagen, allowing the cells to create spaces for lacunae, right? And bridging those things together in little channels to allow cells to connect to each other. Okay, so essentially, an osteoblast and osteoclast will work in tandem with each other, right? Osteoclast breaks stuff down while osteoblast builds stuff up. Okay, and so those can kind of separate and they carry out the major function. Okay, so the really cool thing about osteoblasts is that what will happen is as your cells, like as your bones, say, grow, eventually the osteoblast will kind of take on a new role and function as the main osteocytes, right? If there's damage, right, osteocytes can revert back into osteoblasts and actually can allow for the reproduction. So osteoblasts and osteocytes work together, right? And one becomes the other and vice versa, depending upon what is necessary for the actual function of your bone. Okay. So the really cool thing about osteocytes to remember is that your bone, being this hard matrix made out of calcium phosphate, right, there's got to be some way for these soft cells to actually touch and interact with each other. Okay, and they do that by actually integrating with kind of these small channels that occur between the different cells. They actually come together and kind of touch like this to allow diffusion between the membranes of our different cells. And I'll go through an image of that here in a sec. But essentially what you have are these cell membranes that branch from the lacunae into these network kind of spaces inside of your bone, these like microscopic channels inside the bone that are called canaliculi, which is my favorite anatomical term, canaliculi. So canaliculi just means tiny canal. Okay, so canal, like a channel, right? Liculi just refers to like kind of branching and connecting, right? But a canaliculi is going to be, or canaliculus is going to be kind of where those points are going to come together. And I'll show you what that looks like in a diagrammatic view here in a second. And we'll actually get to see that on some histology slides. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is just kind of the basic unit of bone. Okay, so like all of the other structures that we've talked about in the body, like you have the cell being the basic unit of tissues, right? In this, you have an osteon, which is referring to the basic unit that builds our compact bone. So builds kind of the supportive, the most dense part of your bone. Okay, so what's happening here is that in an osteon, right, which is our basic unit of compact bone. So here I have kind of a diagram of what that looks like. So this is a histological view of what's going on here, right? In each of these units, this kind of circle here represents one of those osteons. Okay, so those osteons come together and interact with each other to produce this structure, okay, that then builds itself into the larger bone structure. Okay. So the basic unit of compact bone is going to have a canal that goes right down the center. Okay, so there's got to be a space for a blood vessel to travel through, and that blood vessel is going through what we call a Haversian canal, which is named after the guy that discovered it. And around that conversion canal, you're going to have a bunch of different rings that are going to kind of extend around it. So you can kind of think of like sort of like a tree trunk, right? You got like the center part of the tree, and then you've got these different areas that are growing out around it. Okay, so each layer is going to kind of have a ring of cells around it, and then it's going to build around that ring of cells. Okay, so osteons are pretty big, right? 0.2 millimeters, which is a pretty large thing in diameter, and there can be several millimeters long, and some can be really, really big, some can be really small, depending upon when they're made, right? And that central canal, that Haversian canal, is where essentially we're having a lot of our blood flow come in. This is where most of our nutrients are coming from, and actually to support what's going on in our cell. Okay, so the central canal contains that blood supply. So let's just go through and identify kind of what are the structures that are there. And you have this image that we can identify in talking about kind of the main structures inside of our microscopic bone. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at that. So what I'm going to do is just kind of get that image here, all right, zoom it in a little bit. Okay, boom, that's away. All right. Okay, so what we have here is our basic kind of structure. Okay, so if you look at this image here, A, this is just showing you kind of a cross section through a chunk of bone. Okay, so out here you have what we call the compact bone, okay, which is going to be kind of on the outside, and you can see that here. This is compact in this little one. Okay, and inside of this, you see this ring where there's kind of these branches. This is what we call spongy bone. And this is where bone marrow is, kind of attaching to those different structures there. Okay, you can see here in this particular structure kind of the layered rings of what we call our osteon. Okay, so each of these little circles, like what's happening around here, is representing an osteon. Okay, so the osteon here, you can see how we have the different rings, and those rings inside of them, like this ring here, is going to have our osteocytes. And those osteocytes are connected together by our canaliculi. Okay, so those canaliculi are going to allow those things to come together so that you've got your bone that can function. Okay, so each of these layers, okay, these rings inside of our osteon, we call this a lamella. Okay. Okay, so lamella is just going to be kind of that ring. Okay, right. So like laminate, right? That's just going to refer to kind of these layers that are going on here. So again, these are the layers. They're called lamella. Okay. Here in the center part, you can see this blood vessel kind of popping out. This is where we have our haversian canal. And this is where, again, we have blood that's coming in. And again, our blood supply is going to provide us with all the nutrients that we need for our bones to do what they need to do, right? And that's what's depicted here. These are blood vessels, okay, that are showing up in this particular image. Okay, so osteons are going to be found in our compact bone. Okay, they're going to be kind of on the outer side of our bone. Right here, you can see the spongy bone, and it's called spongy just because it looks like a sponge, not because it's like soft or squishy. It's actually hard. Okay, which is going to be more deep inside the bone. Okay, so what we have here in this image is we have kind of our basic structure of what's going on inside of a cell. So each of these internal rings right here, this represents the haversian canal. And around here, you can see each of the different rings, or the lamella, that are kind of going out in concentric circles around. So this whole thing right here represents an osteon. Okay, so you can see the bone is actually a whole bunch of osteons that are put together that carry out kind of our main, structural components inside of our cells, or inside of our bone. Okay, all right, so that's kind of like the basics of what bone is, right? The kind of microscopic structures that come together to build the internal structures inside of bone, right? So you've got inside of these osteons, your osteocytes, right? Or osteoblasts if they're building, or osteoclasts if they're being torn down, to say if they're damaged or old and need to get replaced. Okay, so if you've got more specific questions about what's going on inside the skeletal system, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. Thanks.